DevilNeverCry.
Resident Evil 5. One of the best co-op games of all time. A game that lives on through its virtuous memes of boulder breaking and complete global saturation. And in this video, we're gonna see if I can play Resident Evil 5 from start to finish and get my money back. For the unaware and uninitiated, here's exactly how things are going to work. Steam as a platform has a specific refund policy where, with no questions asked, they will provide you a refund provided your request meets two specific requirements. The first of which is that the game you're trying to refund must have been purchased within 14 days, which doesn't necessarily apply to us. The second criteria, however, is that you must have less than 2 hours total playtime when putting your refund request in. And so therein lies our challenge. I need to beat Resident Evil 5 in under 2 hours if I want to get my money back. Taking a brief look at the speedrun leaderboards for Resident Evil 5, it seems as though beating the game in under 2 hours is feasible and physically possible, provided of course you are a seasoned speedrunner of Resident Evil 5 and you are able to reset to get an optimal run. I, on the other hand, have absolutely no experience speedrunning Resident Evil 5, and I also am not at the liberty of resetting whenever something doesn't go my way, because I have a hard cap on the time I can spend. Without any preparation, I'll simply be relying on what I can remember from when I played this game casually. It goes without saying that I'll be playing on a fresh save file, and though this is a co-op game, I'll be running through this solo, with the AI taking the lead of my partner Sheva, who, you may or may not know, can be very unreliable at times. To try and balance this out and alleviate this, I'll be playing on amateur, that way the deck isn't stacked against me too hard. But I think it's time that I finally stop talking and start playing Resident Evil 5. So here we are at the start of our Resident Evil 5 run, and as you're about to find out, this is one of the most infuriating runs that I've ever done. All of the frustration and quite honestly added challenge to this run all boils down to Sheva, our AI partner, and the fact that you could be doing everything you need to be doing to make this run a success, and Sheva will go completely rogue. Whether it's the fact that Sheva loves to hoard healing items, grenades, and ammunition, loves to waste her own ammunition, or sometimes just doesn't even follow you, it can all get to a boiling point. There were several moments in this run where I died directly due to Sheva's actions, or inactions so to speak. One of the more common things that happens in this game, thanks to it being thoroughly designed around the co-op aspect, is that for you to sometimes progress through specific doors that will allow you to get onto the next sequence, both players need to be present within the vicinity of that door. It can mean that I can sprint to a door, running past all of the enemies who've just spawned in, and Sheva could be wasting time collecting items, shooting enemies, and that essential delay may mean that both of us would be killed, and a lot of time would be wasted as we'd be thrown back to the next checkpoint, and all of this could have been avoided if Sheva had just simply followed me and done the exact same thing. With that out of the way though, let's actually talk about what's going on in this run. So we start off on chapter 1-1, and there pretty much isn't very much challenge in this run whatsoever. You're thrown into a few encounters which are easily skippable, with the main challenge coming right at the end of chapter 1-1 when you have to face off against the executioner in an arena where the objective is to simply just survive. Having said that, there are a few things I must accomplish in this encounter to set us up for the rest of the run. The first thing we need to do is to kill the executioner. Not only will this allow us to explore the remaining area without being under constant threat of being killed in one hit, but it also gives us a treasure, and treasure is going to be key to the success of this role. But more on that later. We also pick up the VZ-61 submachine gun, which is going to be our main weapon for a period of time, and we go around collecting as much ammunition and, more importantly, as many grenades as possible. Having survived that ordeal, that then leads us on to chapter 1-2. At the beginning of this chapter, I sell my handgun and transfer all of my handgun ammo over to Sheva. This key distinction of me using a machine gun and Sheva using a pistol will hopefully stop Sheva wasting all of the ammo that I may need. Similar to chapter 1-1, chapter 1-2 is a breeze to go through until the ending sequence. Funnily enough, we skip the shotgun in this chapter, which I almost never do, but as we get on to the end, we have to face off against the Ouroboros boss. though we can easily defeat this tentacle hentai monster by simply burning him up in a furnace before moving on towards the end of the mission. With the entirety of Chapter 1 smoothly out of the way, it's time to start off with Chapter 2-1, where we begin in a warehouse by picking up the MP5 machine gun. With our previous weapon having outlived its usefulness, this new machine gun will be our main weapon for the rest of the game. We start off the mission in a maze of containers filled to the brim with explosives and parasitic dogs. Taking care not to blow ourselves up, we move on to the next area. Taking care not to get ourselves run over, we sprint our way to our next encounter. Of course, I make my way to the door first, with Sheva lagging terribly behind, causing me to get bit as I wait. We lace up our shoes once more in the next area and sprint to our main objective, where we coincidentally skip past the S75 rifle. It hurts skipping weapons in this game, but it has to be done for this run. This next area should seem quite familiar to you if you played the Resident Evil 5 demo. It's the area where we must face off against the Chainsaw Majini. Before doing that, we quickly skip a lengthy sequence by banking a grenade off of a wall to blow up a lock, allowing us to exit a building. And it is at this point in the run that we begin to abuse checkpoints to our advantage. You see, Resident Evil 5 constantly updates its checkpoints, and it even tells you that it's doing so with a marker on screen. This area here is filled to the brim with enemies as we make our way to the Chainsaw Majini, but by simply restarting the checkpoint that we get before facing off against the masked murderer, we're able to remove all of the enemies in the area. This is a mechanic that I end up using multiple times throughout the run to simply put myself and Sheva in a more advantageous positions and to remove enemies at times that otherwise would be slowing us down. The Chainsaw Majini ended up needing more grenades that I actually had on me, thanks to me wasting them on the previous skip, and he ends up grazing me with his chainsaw, putting me into a dying state. We eventually prevail though, and we end up robbing his coffers of all the treasures they have before moving on to the next mission. Again, on the topic of treasures, it is paramount that I collect as many as possible, as I'm going to need to trade these treasures in for money so that I can buy rocket launchers to defeat bosses quickly at certain points. Though I end up making the mistake of not memorizing how many rocket launchers I need to get through the game comfortably, and it ends up being a bit of an issue later on. We move on to the end of Chapter 2-1, but not before completing a few quick-time events in the ending cutscene, which happens quite often throughout Resident Evil 5. Chapter 2-2 begins in an abandoned train yard, where again we get tag-teamed by parasitic dogs and even more explosives. After doing away with them, we make our way through a labyrinthine mining system in complete darkness. Sheva opens up the gate to escape just in the nick of time before I end up getting surrounded, and we sprint through a multi-layered cave. As this enemy pulls a stick of TNT out his ass and throws it at me, I end up blowing it up immediately in his face before we move on to the next area. Here, I quickly pick up the Dragunov sniper rifle, sprint past a machine gun turret which fills me full of thick hot piping rounds of lead, and then we move on to the next boss. Here's where the first major mistake of the run happens and I begin to lose time. I end up correctly stunning the boss with a hand grenade, which is all part of the speedrun strat, but what's not part of it is missing several sniper rifle shots into its weak point. After missing those crucial shots and unloading every other weapon I have into this monster, I end up running around like a headless chicken, desperate to find more ammunition to put the boss down, which we eventually do. The next chapter, Chapter 2-3, plays out entirely as an on-rail shooter, where we face off against multiple people in a car chase, and finishes off with a fight against bootleg El Gigante. There's not really anything that you can skip in this entire sequence, and it ends up being quite uneventful, other than the fact that Sheva is completely useless, and whilst I was focusing on certain enemies, I was constantly getting blindsided by others, almost getting us killed. Back on somewhat solid ground with Chapter 3-1 Marshlands, we first start off this chapter by collecting 4 pieces of stone. The start of this chapter is largely open-ended, and we can collect all of these pieces of stone in any order that we wish to. We don't face much trouble in this opening area, considering we're able to sprint past every enemy that spawns in conveniently after we pick up these stone pieces. We almost end up getting eaten by a crocodile, or perhaps it's an alligator, not quite sure, and we find a mysteriously abandoned rocket launcher in the middle of this swamp, but I'm not one to complain. After completing this opening sequence though, is where things begin to go wrong yet again. By taking a very specific route, you should be able to pick up this magnum without too much trouble. However, Sheva decides not to wait and follows me instead, I believe setting off this ambush where we're forced to face off against certain enemies. This then throws this entire combat sequence into disarray, as we're now not able to just sprint through this final bit, and we have to defeat every single enemy in the area before we're able to progress. Had we not set off the previous ambush, we would have faced a marginally smaller amount of enemies and could have got through this area quickly, but such is life with an AI partner. Thankfully, Chapter 3.2 starts off a whole lot more smoothly, as I'm able to do even more restart checkpoint manipulations, and I'm able to deftly avoid being this crocodile's breakfast. But once again, I speak too soon, as the second half of this chapter goes horribly wrong. I take too long defeating this head twister, which means I'm delayed in turning this valve, and the chainsaw Majini makes quick work of me. After eating a bunch of time loss thanks to a horrible checkpoint, we end up prevailing before moving on to a sequence where we need to defend Josh, which goes quite successfully, and we end up finishing the mission after an escape sequence. Chapter 3.3 ends up being way more difficult than it needs to be after starting it off with pretty much no ammunition whatsoever and very low health. After pulling through that sequence by the skin of our teeth, thanks to some green herbs, we move on to the Irving boss fight, which ends up being absolutely horrible. Rocket launchers in Resident Evil 5 will literally kill any single enemy or boss in one hit, bar Wesker that is, provided you hit them in the right spot. The issue with doing this with Irving is that his vulnerable point only shows up after a few minutes of hitting him with standard rounds, and the vulnerable point likes to move around considerably. Couple the erratic movement in with the fact that the rocket launcher fires incredibly slowly and there is a delay between firing and actually hitting the target, and it means that your aim could be on point, but by the time the rocket launcher actually ends up reaching its target, the boss could have moved entirely. And the reason that I'm explaining all of this to you is because, well, can you believe it? I missed twice. After resisting the urge to put my fist through my monitor, we eventually prevail and Irving dies like a chump. Finally back on solid ground with Chapter 4.1, we move into a set of indigenous ruins. This chapter is fairly easy compared to the previous ones, as we're largely able to sprint past the majority of the enemies that we encounter. We almost end up getting teabagged by a large set of giant flaming balls. We almost die after a long sprinting QuickTime event sequence, and when that's all said and done, we spend a considerable amount of time in a large chamber, pulling on a set of levers in a very specific sequence. The Bat Nipple boss ends up making a reappearance right at the very end, but we're able to make it to the end of Chapter 4.1 by just simply sprinting away from it. Chapter 4.2, however, is a nightmare in comparison. This chapter starts off with you having to collect 3 separate emblems scattered around this maze-like area, which isn't so bad once you know the specific route. The issue with this area, however, is the fact that there are lasers that run through the lengths of all of these corridors constantly on a timer, and as such you need to be careful, otherwise they can hit you with a large amount of damage. Couple this in with the fact that you're constantly being hounded by enemies, both tanks and lightweights alike, and this can be quite tricky. The main issue, however, that I had is the fact that for one of these emblems, I had to throw Sheva over a gap, and she needed to go and pick up this emblem by herself. I quickly threw her over and then ended up sprinting to the final emblem in the meantime, but then quickly realized after picking that emblem up that no matter how long I waited or whatever commands I gave, Sheva would not pick up this final emblem. Instead, she was hellbent in fighting the enemies that spawned there, and even after she ran out of all of the ammo she had, she still didn't want to pick up this goddamn emblem. No matter, I thought, I'll quickly put these emblems in, grab a checkpoint, and then reset, upon which I was able to throw her over again, and would you believe it, she still wouldn't pick it up. Not until, of course, I threw her over, called her back to my side, and then threw her over for a third time whilst I was dealing with all of the enemies that she finally picked it up. After contemplating the stupidity of this ordeal and once again suppressing the urge to throw my controller into orbit, we move on with the rest of Chapter 4.2. The following puzzle sequences in Chapter 4.2 are very simple. The only issue is that if you so much as touch a single one of these stupid lasers, the game will immediately end as it kills you instantly. Why it does this and the lasers in Chapter 4.1 don't, I have no idea, but I digress. We end the chapter and move on. Chapter 5.1 spits us out of the ruins and into a lab, where we run into a familiar enemy from the Resident Evil series, the Lickers. These enemies are blind, but their hearing is impeccable, and they're quite lethal at close range. With all that information in mind, I sprint into an enclosure full of them before opening a gate and sprinting to our next objective. After breaching the piece of even more Lickers and sprinting away, We have to defend against a horde of them as we wait for an elevator to come to our rescue. Thankfully, a grenade launcher that I picked up in 4.1 makes quick work of them, and we move on to the ending sequence of this chapter. The game wants us to enter into a gripping and harrowing experience fighting a giant enemy crab as a boss, but the experience ends up being too much for Chris to handle, who lasts all of 5 seconds, as he fills the giant enemy crab's mouth with a rocket launcher and just lets it go off. Chapter 5.2 is where this run, and quite honestly this game, ends up taking a turn for the worst, as this is where the game decides to start including enemies that feature automatic rifles. After sprinting through a myriad of these enemies and getting to a door in which both Sheva and I need to be there, I end up almost dying as Sheva ends up taking her sweet ass time as I end up getting riddled with bullets. And if you think that's bad, just wait until you run into a room full of enemies with rocket launchers of their own. Sprinting our way past lickers and even more enemies with weapons, we end up to a conveyor belt section where we need to deftly dodge boxes coming our way lest we be thrown into a furnace ourselves and burned to cinders. As we make our way through more moving conveyor belts, we come to an area filled to the brim with what seems like alien cocoons. We eventually encounter an enemy with one of the cooler designs in Resident Evil history, being the Reaper. The Reapers are essentially giant African cockroaches which have been warped and twisted by the Ouroboros virus. After putting the Reapers to bed, all that remains is this boss's chapter, which is the hentai tentacle monster who's come back for round 2. Before it can fill any orifices though, we end up blowing it to smithereens and moving on to the next chapter, 5.3. The start of this chapter ends up being a major pain in our ass, as we have to face off against a myriad of enemies with rifles and 3 separate Reapers as we wait for a platform to make its way over to us. Did I mention that Reapers are incredibly annoying to face off against? It's very hard to run by them, as they have a one-hit kill move where if they literally touch you, they'll throw you into a canned animation that is literally a guaranteed game over. After several restarts, some time loss, and some checkpoint manipulation, we eventually make it past this sequence, past the next giant rotating elevator sequence, before we have to face off against another armada of lickers, who thankfully Sheva plays ball with, and we make it to the end boss of this chapter, Wesker. Mr. Complete Global Saturation. Trying to go for the speed strat here straight off the bat, ironically ended up wasting a considerable amount of time, so I opted to go for my tried and tested strategy of just putting a rocket launcher through the side of his head as he turns around a corner. That then brings us on to the second part of this boss fight, Jill Valentine. After unloading all over her chest, with the Magnum that is, we end up finally coming to the end of this boss fight. Chapter 6.1 has us traverse through a large cargo ship, both on the outside, above board, and below deck on the inside. There's a skippable sequence here where Sheva is captured, which can be avoided provided you snipe a few enemies at the start of this mission, which I unfortunately didn't do as I didn't have the right rifle on me. In the final encounter here, a giant Gatling gun wielding foe stands in our way who meets his quick end at the hands of a rocket launcher. Chapter 6.2 starts us off with a lengthy quick-time event sequence before quickly shepherding us into the Excella boss fight who, surprise surprise, has been turned into a hentai tentacle monster thanks to Ouroboros. Luckily for Excella, however, we decide to quickly put her out of her misery with a well-placed rocket launcher, which thankfully this time was very easy to connect with. And then we come to Chapter 6.3, the final chapter of Resident Evil 5, and boy is it a long chapter. With the ship now essentially imploding, we have to make our way through a myriad of difficult enemy encounters featuring fan favorites such as rifle-wielding enemies, rocket-wielding enemies, and of course, Reapers. The Reapers were the only things that really gave me any degree of difficulty and caused a few restarts, primarily because I didn't have the ammunition needed to deal with them whatsoever. It was at this point when I was considering buying ammo that I realized I had made a grave mistake, in fact the biggest one of this run overall. I didn't pick up enough treasure, which meant I didn't have the money needed to buy the rocket launchers required to get through the rest of this chapter quite comfortably. After suffering a substantial amount of time loss getting the ammo required to defeat the Reapers and blowing up the 2 Gatling gun enemies right at the end with a rocket launcher, we face off against Wesker for a second time, where the aim of this boss is to blow him up with a rocket launcher and then Sheva can come in and dose him with roofies or Ouroboros or whatever it is that we inject him with so the fight can end. Sheva, of course, in all of her infinite wisdom is far too slow, so we have to go through multiple cycles of blowing up Wesker and suffering a lot of time loss. After finally convincing Wesker to take his meds and a series of long QuickTime events, we end up at the heart of a volcano, where, against all odds, we somehow haven't burnt to death. Now I know that most of you who are tuning into this run are only doing so that you can see Chris Redfield fisting a giant boulder sweetly and softly, grunting in ecstasy as he does so. But there will not be any of that smut on this channel here. As soon as Wesker has his back to us, we blow the ever-loving fuck out of him with a rocket launcher, finally finishing this run. And as we see the chapter results screen and the run ends, we can see our final time. We have conquered Resident Evil 5 in 2 hours, 29 minutes and 2 seconds. Well, there you have it, the climactic finale of our Resident Evil 5 run. Now, looking at some of the comments on these previous challenge videos, a lot of you seem convinced that I can get a refund even after going over the 2-hour limit if I just go to Steam and plead my case directly, which is what I decided to do. All things said and done, I think I made a pretty convincing argument here, but Steam didn't seem to agree. If you're still watching, still listening, I want to say a big thank you for making it to the very end of this video, and thank you for all of your support. Let me know down in the comments below what game you want to see me tackle next, and who knows, maybe you'll see me suffer through your suggestion next. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.